This is in the District Court of Hidalgo County, Texas, 93rd Judicial District. The plaintiff is Eva Reina Ayala et al. The defendants are Phillips Properties, Inc. et al. Today's date is January 20, 2003. This is case number C-4597-92-B. The witness is Dr. Peter F. Infante. The location of the deposition is 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue, Northwest, Washington, D.C. Appearing on behalf of the plaintiff is J. Scott McLean of Reed, Carrera, and McLean. Calling the deposition on behalf of the defendants, American Exploration Company and Louis Dreyfus Natural Gas Corporation, are Larkin C. Eakin Jr. and Ruth A. Brenton of Winstead, Seacrest, and Minnick. Appearing on behalf of the defendant, Adafina Petrochemicals, Inc., FINA, Inc., FKA American Petrofina, Incorporated, FINA Oil and Chemical Company, FKA American Petrofina Company of Texas, Total Fina Elf, E&P USA, Inc., and Petrofina Delaware, Incorporated, is Christy M. Rice of Vincent & Elkins. Appearing on behalf of the defendant, Best, Inc., FP Phillips Jr., Inc., Phillips Properties, Inc., and TMCS, Inc., is Robert Fuente of the law offices of Frank Enriquez. Appearing on behalf of the defendant, Falconer Energy Joint Venture, 1988, Falconer Energy Corporation, and Vernon E. Falconer, Inc., is J.W. Dyer of Dyer and Associates. Appearing on behalf of the defendant, Chevron USA, is Keith N. Ewells of Royston, Rayer, Vickery, and Williams. Appearing on behalf of the defendant, Ultramar Diamond Shamrock, FKA Diamond Shamrock and Valley Shamrock, Inc., is Phil Werner of Werner and Kerrigan. Appearing on behalf of the defendant, Missouri Pacific Improvement Company and Union Pacific Railroad Company, is Marjorie C. Batzel of Rodriguez, Colvin, and Cheney. Also present is Craig Morin. The officer before whom this videotaped deposition is taken and sworn by is Desiree Jura. The video camera operator is Raymond Heer, representing Alderson Reporting Company, 1111 14th Street Northwest, Suite 400, Washington, D.C., 20005. This videotaped deposition commenced at 9:55:04. Please swear in the witness.
If you raise your right hand, sir, do you swear affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Dr. Infante, would you state your name for the record, please, sir?
Yes, Peter Francis Infante.
And you are appearing here as a witness on behalf of the plaintiffs, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And as we go forward, I'll talk to you a little bit about why you've been retained in this case, or your understanding of why you've been retained. But first of all, let me show you what's been marked as Infante Exhibit Number 1, which is a copy of the deposition notice in this case, and ask if you've seen that before or if you're appearing pursuant to that deposition notice.
Yes, I have seen it, and I am appearing pursuant to it.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Infante. Would you make me another folder since I screwed that one up? Let me hand you what's been marked as Exhibit Number 2. And ask if this is a true and correct copy of the report that you have rendered in this case, together with a copy of the references contained therein, and attached thereto a copy of your curriculum vitae.
Yes, it is.
Is that your most current curriculum vitae?
Yes.
Okay. And I think it shows that about 1997 was about the last paper that you published. Is that correct?
Well, that's the last one. I haven't updated this since '97.
Okay. Have you published any papers since 1997, Dr. Infante?
Yes.
Okay. Could you generally tell us the topics and where they were published?
Yes. I published a paper on the historical information about the hazards of benzene, and that was published by the European Environmental Agency, either 2000 or 2001, I believe.
Okay. And what, was that published in a publication, or was it just published by the agent? It was an agency report or publication?
It was an agency publication, and it was one of a number of papers in that publication.
Any other reports since then?
It's the only one I can recall.
Was there any particular group that you were looking at the effects of benzene concerning in that paper, or was it just generalized as to the effects of benzene?
Objection form.
It was a paper on the historical knowledge of the toxicity of benzene. So it reviewed from the earliest reports of benzene poisoning up to the information in the literature of somewhere around 2000 or 1999.
Dr. Infante, let me hand you a group of documents with a rubber band around it, which has been labeled as Infante Exhibit 3. And for the record, it contains documents bearing the Bates labels PI, which I assume is Peter Infante 1, through PI 196. And I ask you just to look through that. And my question actually as to those documents is a simple one. And are those the only documents that you have produced to your attorneys in connection with this litigation?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Are those the only documents
Objection form.
that you have produced? Are those the only documents that you produced to your attorney? Or, I'm sorry, strike that. Are those the only documents that you produced to the attorneys who employed you in this case?
I believe so, yes. At the time I was asked to do that. Whether I've produced any since then or not, I can't. I don't think I did.
Okay. You did not produce copies of the reports that you've referenced. I'm going to strike that. You've not produced copies of the papers that you've referenced in your report. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Dr. Infante, you have been deposed on a number of occasions, correct?
Yes.
How often would you estimate now that you've been deposed?
Objection form.
Well, I don't really know, probably. Well, I don't know how many times, maybe more recently, every other month.
And have you always, in your lifetime and in your career, have you given more than 30 depositions?
That's possible. I'm not sure.
Could you have given as many as 40?
Oh, I don't really know.
Now, you retired as an employee of the Occupational Safety and Hazards Bureau, OSHA, correct?
The Occupational Safety and Health Administration.
Health Administration,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes, sir.
And when did you retire?
May 31st of last year.
Prior to the time that you retired from OSHA, had you given depositions in an individual capacity?
Yes, sir.
And when you gave those depositions, you were giving the opinions of Peter Infante and not the opinions necessarily of OSHA, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And those were done on your own time and not on government time, correct?
Yes, sir.
Is it a fair statement, Dr. Infante, that the depositions that you've given, that maybe as many as 30, possibly 40, have always been on behalf of claimants in cases involving benzene?
Yes, sir.
Have you ever given a deposition on behalf of a defendant in a case involving benzene?
No, I've never been asked.
Are most of the cases on which you have been retained to consult or render an opinion concerning the effects of benzene cases involving the effect of benzene on a particular individual or individuals in terms of a causal connection between benzene and that person having a particular illness?
Yes.
Have you ever given a deposition in a case involving community exposure as opposed to exposure to a particular individual or individuals who had developed a particular disease as a result of that exposure?
Objection form.
As best I can recall, I think this is the only time.
Now, as you talked, you worked for OSHA, and the first word in OSHA is occupational, correct?
Yes, sir.
Is it a fair statement that the field of your epidemiological studies has been worker safety?
Primarily, yes.
And have the epidemiological studies that you yourself designed and gathered the data for been primarily for occupational study of the effects of benzene?
Well, ones that I've conducted myself have been in the occupational setting because, like, I worked for NIOSH and OSHA, but I've also reviewed literature for environmental studies when they were, appropriate for the data set I might have been looking at.
Objection responses.
Dr. Infante, have you ever done a neighborhood or community environmental epidemiological study?
Yes.
Where was that?
In Ohio.
And where in Ohio, let's strike that. What were you studying in Ohio? What community?
Well, there were a couple things. One is I think I published a paper on childhood leukemia mortality rates for the state, for this entire state of Ohio back in the 70s. And then I also published a couple papers looking at birth defects in communities that had vinyl chloride polymerization facilities.
Now, as to the study that you did concerning the children in Ohio, was that after you had received your training as an epidemiologist?
Yes.
Now, you also have a dental license, is that correct?
Yes.
And you were born in Lima, Ohio?
Yes, sir.
Did you know a Dr. Snow in Lima, Ohio?
That sounds familiar.
His daughter is now a court reporter in Houston. I just thought the world was too small for that to be too big a coincidence. When you published the paper concerning children, if we could look at your CV, Dr. Infante, which I've opened there.
Yes.
Could you point out on which page of your CV that particular, I see on the second page about roughly halfway down your publication on polyvinyl chloride production facilities. And then above it, there is an epidemiologic study of deciduous molar relations in preschool children and secular trends in leukemia mortality. Are those the studies you're discussing?
No, there's one specifically related to secular changes in leukemia in children.
Okay, could you find that and just mark it with a check mark, please, sir?
It should be in 75. I'm still looking. Newton is one of the co-authors. Oh, here we go. No, that's not it.
It may well be in there. I looked and did not see that particular study, but I may not know what I'm looking at.
Yeah, I don't see it in here.
Where was that published, if you recall, Dr. Infante?
I believe it was published in The Lancet,
And you, approximately what year?
1975.
Would you tell us a little bit about the study itself? Was it a cohort study?
No, it was a study of looking at the secular changes in the incidence of leukemia in children in the state of Ohio.
Okay, and by secular changes, what do you mean?
Changes over time.
And were you looking at any particular causative or causal chemical and or substance in looking at it, or were you just looking at the disease itself?
We're looking at the disease itself.
So this was not a benzene study.
That's correct.
Have you ever conducted a benzene study from an epidemiological standpoint on children?
No.
And while we're talking about studies, there are various types of studies and methods that can be used to look at the effect of a particular chemical on a particular population or a particular person, correct?
Yes.
One of those is called a cohort study, correct?
Yes.
And could you tell us just very briefly what a cohort study is?
Well, a cohort study is a study that's designed as such that you take a group of individuals identified as the cohort, and then you follow them in time and see what they die from, and then you compare deaths for specific causes to the number of deaths for those same specific causes based upon rates in the standard population. And then usually the summary statistic that you use is a standardized mortality ratio. So, okay.
And as you conduct a cohort study, those studies sometimes are observed well past the publication of the initial paper on that particular cohort, correct?
Well, it couldn't be observed past the publication of the paper because usually you're publishing the paper.
Well, let me give you an
Results
example. Your first actual benzene cohort study was your 1977 pliofilm study, correct?
Yes.
And there have been numerous papers published since that time by others who looked at that same cohort, correct?
There have been a few, yes.
In fact, there has been papers published as late as 2002 concerning that particular cohort, correct?
All right, well, I don't recall one in 2002, but there have been. Rinsky updated the cohort in 81, then I think he updated it in a publication in 87. Then Paxton performed an update and published in 94. Those are the ones that I'm aware of.
Has there been an update done in 2000, as of 2002 by Rinsky?
If there hasn't been, I haven't seen it.
Dr. Infante, is the pliofilm study the only epidemiological study where you have personally collected and developed the data for that study concerning benzene and its causal effects?
Is it the only study?
Yes, the only cohort study where you have personally collected data and examined that data to examine causal effects of benzene on a cohort group.
Well, of a cohort of that nature, yes. I think I published a paper, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago on some elevated risk of leukemia among DC garage mechanics.
Now, that particular paper you published concerning the DC garage mechanics concerned 3 African American males here in Washington, D.C., correct?
Well, there were 3 African males that had contracted leukemia. I was looking at the entire, I was estimating the expected number of leukemias based on the entire working population, but you're correct from the standpoint that there were 3 individuals identified with leukemia that were African American males.
And those 3 African American males had filed a lawsuit claiming that their leukemia was the result of exposure on the job, correct?
They did file a lawsuit. I don't recall that they filed a lawsuit at the time that I published those findings, but I believe they eventually did file a lawsuit.
And did you?
One of them or 2. I don't know if all 3 did or not.
Did you give a deposition in that case on behalf of the claims wherein you expressed an opinion that benzene to which they had been exposed was the causal agent that had caused them to contract leukemia?
I may have. I recall one individual in that case, Stanley Taylor. I just at this time can't recall. I could have done that.
Would you consider that that was an epidemiologically sufficient, strike that, from an epidemiological standpoint, was that a sufficient number to give you any degree of confidence in terms of causation?
Well, I mean, there was already information available that benzene caused leukemia. What I was attempting to do there is point out that the hazards of benzene and other areas that the general scientific community might have forgotten about. So I would I mean, if that were the only information available, I would say no. But given all the information available before that time, I think what I was pointing out was this very high risk of leukemia from the misuse of gasoline.
But that's not what you would call an epidemiological cohort study in the scientific sense, is it?
Well, it was a scientific analysis. It wasn't the same type of cohort study that I conducted when I was at NIOSH, no.
You've also written a number of review papers concerning data and epidemiological studies done by other individuals, correct?
Yes.
Now, we talked about cohort studies. There are other ways to look at causation or causality in terms of whether or not benzene causes certain types of leukemias, correct?
Yes.
Is that called, do we strike that? Is there such a thing as a case control study?
That's correct, yes.
And could you tell us what a case control study is?
You know, in a case control study, you identify the cases of the disease that you're interested in, and then you select controls, meaning individuals that do not have the disease you're interested in, and then you're usually assessing the difference in exposure between cases and controls that are usually selected on the basis of individuals that you're matching to the cases by age, sex, and race.
Is it a fair statement that in the epidemiological community that a cohort study is where you take a group of workers and examine them over a period of time, accumulating what they call years or man years, and you observe the incidences of a particular disease against the number that you would expect to develop in that particular group, naturally or otherwise?
Objection form.
Yeah, well, what you're doing is generating person years.
Okay, person years, thank you.
Okay. You could study women.
Yes, that's true, that's
Okay.
true. Thank you.
And then on the basis of the person years, you estimate how many, if it's a mortality study, most of these studies are mortality studies, you estimate the number of deaths for particular causes that you should expect to see, and you're looking at that in relation to the number of deaths from specific causes that you do observe in the study.
So it's kind of a prospective, it's a looking forward study, correct?
It's like a historical prospective study.
And when we talk about a case control study, we're talking about a study where you already have a diagnosis and you look back in time to see what the causal factors may have been. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Is in the epidemiological community or in those who practice epidemiology, is one or more of, strike that, in the epidemiological community, is one of those two types of studies considered more reliable than the other?
Objection form.
Relative to I would say that a case control study is you have less opportunity for error if it's well conducted.
And the reason for that is in a cohort study, you can have a lot of error in terms of the accumulation of information, diagnoses that are incorrect or diagnoses that are not specific enough. Is that a fair statement?
Objection form.
Well, I mean, you try not to have errors. I mean, if you have a lot of errors, then your cohort study won't be any good either.
You agree that a cohort study is only as good as your data?
Yes. Yeah, the quality of the data and the methodology that's employed in the study.
In terms of numbers, do cohort studies tend to be much larger than case control studies?
I would think so, yes.
And there is such a thing as a cohort study known as a meta-analysis study, where a number of cohort studies are combined and adjusted to try to come up with a standard mortality ratio for the entire group of cohort studies.
It's like combining data from a number of cohort studies and putting all the data together. And looking at the summary statistic, you'd call that a meta-analysis.
What is your opinion personally as to the validity of meta-analysis, just as a principle?
Objection form.
Well, I mean, they're as, meta-analyses are as good as the, the data that are included in them. Sometimes I have a lot of problem with a lot of meta-analyses that are done because they put data from fairly good cohort studies in with data from crummy studies, and you end up, with what I call meta-garbage when those things happen.
Have you ever designed a meta-analysis study?
I haven't done one, but it's not difficult to design one.
Have you, but you've personally not done one, is that correct?
I've not published any meta-analysis. I've been involved in meta-analyses.
Which meta-analyses have you been involved in?
Meta-analyses looking at formaldehyde exposure and individuals that are involved in embalming and anatomy and things like that.
Have you done any meta-analysis, strike that, have you been involved in any meta-analysis studies involving benzene and its causal effects?
Well, I've done analyses looking at specific causes of death in studies. I haven't done like a meta-analysis looking at every cause of death in every cohort study or every refinery study. No.
Dr. Infante, if I could turn your attention to this pile of papers that's labeled as Infante Exhibit number 3.
Okay.
I'd just kind of like to go through that so we can get some idea of what you use these documents for. Now, the top document is a letter that's on Reed, Carrera, and McLean Stationery dated July 12, 2002, correct?
Yes.
And it's a letter from Ms. Baca, am I pronouncing that right? Ms. Baca in Mr. McLean's office, who's a legal assistant, and she just says, enclosed, please find materials pertaining to the above reference case, correct?
Yes.
Were the materials that are listed behind that letter all the way through 196 received by you in this package with this cover letter?
I'm sorry, we didn't labeled 196.
Yes. If you will look at the pages that are labeled 2 through 196, excluding your report, were those the pages that were accompanying this letter? I'm assuming she didn't send you a report. If she did, we have a whole new line of questioning here.
So is your question, with this cover letter,
Yes.
did I receive all of the information?
Other than your
attached
report,
to
which
that?
is in that pile.
Well, I think so. I mean, whether any of this came in later, I can't remember right now.
Fair enough. And if you do remember, we'll talk about it later. On the front page, there's some writing, which is a little hard to read. I do finally have Mr. McLean's cell phone number, so at least I can find him.
I had to change it.
Up at the top. But is the handwriting on this page your handwriting, other than Ms. Baca's?
Yes.
And you received this, it's dated July 12th, and you received it the next day, correct?
Yes.
And then I believe your report, if we look at it, which is, you have over there, your report is dated 10 days later on July 23rd, correct?
Yes.
So you received these documents, and then 10 days later you produced that report for Mr. McLean, correct?
Yes.
Had you requested specific materials be sent to you?
I'm sure I did.
Okay. And are the type of materials that are behind this cover letter the type of materials that you requested be sent to you?
Objection form.
Let me ask that. Are the materials behind this cover letter from Mr. McLean's legal assistant the materials that you requested?
Well, the reason I'm looking, there's another, there might be some I requested and some that I didn't request that he sent also. So.
Okay. Can you, if we look up here at the top, can you read what you've written there?
I can read a few words. I really can't read with.
Okay, what words can you read?
Well, on the top, it looks like it says put. First word's put. Looks like put in, and I don't know what the other words are.
Okay, I agree with that. And then in the second line, the word them appears to be fairly.
Right, them and.
Does it say sample
Looks
air?
like sample air.
Okay. And then below that, there is something that looks like it starts with an H. Can you read that?
Looks like an R, A-R-E.
A-R, okay, you're correct.
Looks like R the something. I don't know what it is.
And then the second line, would you agree that the first word on that second line is organic?
Yes. Looks like organic and air.
Okay. And then under that, are there something, no, what does that say? And then there's a question mark and it's answered yes.
Are these, I don't know what it is. Are these on no side? Question. I don't know what.
Could that be our side?
Are these? I really don't know what it is. Looks like number.
Okay. Do you have the original of this letter at your home or your office?
Yes.
If you go back by the office this evening, could you take a look at it so we can try to discern what that says?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I asked you earlier, but do you recall now whether or not you received any additional documents from Mr. McLean's office after you received the documents under this Federal Express air bill dated July 12, 2002?
Did I receive any additional
Documents.
between then and now, or
Yes.
between this date and when I wrote my report?
Well, let's start between this date and when you wrote your report first.
Well, let me look through this. I don't believe so. I think this is it.
Now, and you raised the question, have you received any documents since you wrote your report?
Yes.
All right, what have you received, Dr. Infante?
I received Dr. Matson's, I think he wrote a report about the benzene exposures.
Okay. And there are portions of that report in these papers, correct?
Oh, I don't know, but, no, and then I also received Dr. Wong's report,
Okay.
and then copies of all of the studies that were attached to, that were, I believe, referenced in Dr. Wong's report. There might have been some other, I don't recall if there were some other reports related to exposure at McCallum that were done by defendants, or there could possibly be, I can't recall right now.
What use have you made of those reports concerning exposure done by the other defendants?
Well, I didn't really make use of those in the report.
Okay. Have you made any use of them since then for any purposes?
No.
Has anything about them changed or in any way modified your opinions as expressed in your report?
No.
Was there anything in Dr. Wong's report that you have relied upon in terms of the testimony you're giving here today?
No.
Is there anything in Dr. Wong's report that has caused you to change or modify the opinions that are set forth in your report?
No.
What about Dr. Madsen's report? Did you see any information in Dr. Madsen's report that causes you to change or modify any of the opinions that you've stated in your report?
No.
Now, you list a number of publications to support various points within your report. Do you anticipate that you will rely upon other reports to support your opinions as expressed in your July 23rd, 2002 report?
Objection form.
Well, I may if there's new information. In fact, there was, as I was looking through it the other day, I saw there was a case control study that I would have cited, but I forgot about it. It was published in 1970 by Gerard and Revol. It's a study associating chronic lymphatic leukemia and benzene exposure. It was originally published in French, and it's been translated into English.
Where was the English translation published?
The French, it was published in French, and the translation that I have was done by NIOSH had it done. So as well, I was still at NIOSH.
We can furnish it to you in French if you want.
Ruth could read it to me.
I'll be glad to do that.
She has one of those good educations. It's a case control study.
Yes.
What's the size of the study in terms of how many people? With
How many cases?
Yeah, how many cases with chronic?
I think, well, they were looking at various leukemias, and I think there were, as best I can recall, 140 some, maybe 142.
Was there any particular industry involved?
Well, there was a case control study, so they were looking at the disease versus individuals that were admitted to these two hospitals in Lyon, France, that did not have a hematological disease, and they were looking for differences in exposure. Then there was a...
That's a 1970 study?
yes, sir.
Okay, go ahead. And then anything else?
Yeah, there was a paper that was just published in 2002 that I wasn't aware of when I wrote my report that has to do with benzene and leukemia by, it's published in English, but it's got another French author. It's Guenel, G-U-G-N-E-L.
Has it been translated to English?
It was published in English.
Oh, thank you. We're still looking at Exhibit 3, which, as we pointed out, contains numbers at the bottom with the letters PI and then a number. If we look over at what is PI number 2, this is a monitoring well drilling record from Valley Scientific Remediation, Inc., correct?
Yes.
Is this a document that you requested or one that was just sent to you?
It was, well, I requested information related to what type of contamination there was.
And,
Something I didn't know this record existed per se.
and you notice up at the top it refers to Phillips Properties, Inc.
Yes.
Do you know who Phillips Properties, Inc. is in this case?
No, not really.
What use, let's turn to the page that's marked PI 3. There seems to be some writing and a question mark over the OVM readings. Somebody has written in meter and a question mark. Is that your handwriting?
Yes.
Okay. Were you trying to determine what a
OVM.
OVM meter was, or OB meter was?
Well, OVM readings, it said.
Okay. Let's go to the page that's marked PI 4, which is another Valley Scientific Remediation, Inc.
Yes.
for monitoring well number 20. There seems to be an asterisk and some highlighting here. Is that something that was done by you?
Yes.
And why are you highlighting and putting an asterisk there, Dr. Infante?
Because I noticed that just, what it had indicated here, that there was slight hydrocarbon odor and present, and so that's why I put a asterisk there.
As we go through these, you have consistently highlighted where you saw odors present, correct?
Yes.
Would you agree that the degree of hydrocarbon odor is somewhat of a subjective determination in a document like this?
Objection.
Well, how do you mean that?
Well, there is no objective way of quantifying an odor as slight, medium, or heavy, is there?
Objection.
It's in the nose of the smeller.
Objection.
Well, yes, that's right. I mean, but, it would be different if someone said it was very strong, irritating odor. That gives you some information on exposure. I wasn't using it to quantify, per se.
Now, you cannot tell from this description what hydrocarbon odor is being smelled, what type of hydrocarbon, correct?
That's right.
Does benzene have an odor?
Yes.
It's one of the reasons it's called an aromatic, correct?
Well, it's called an aromatic because of its chemical structure, and that
And it smells.
exactly know that. Yeah, well, a lot of chemicals smell. I mean, it has specifically a sweet odor.
Yes. And do you have an opinion at what level benzene can be smelled?
Yes, between, I think you can, let's see, what's the AIHA has a document on threshold limits, and I think it indicates something like 61 you can detect it, and then at 96 or 97 parts per million you can recognize it as benzene.
And you have actually, in cases, given opinions as to exposure based upon descriptions of smell, correct?
Yes.
To your knowledge, does raw, as opposed to utility natural gas, have a smell?
Objection.
In other words, I'm talking about gas in a well that's being produced into a pipeline as opposed to the gas that comes on when you turn on your stove or your heater.
Objection.
So what's your question to me again?
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not that gas it's produced from the ground before it is used as utility gas, that is, before it's been used by your utility company, does that gas have a smell?
Objection.
No, I don't know.
At what level would benzene have to be present in raw natural gas and natural gas condensate in order for you to be able to smell benzene?
Objection.
Would it be this 61 detect limit?
Objection.
To smell benzene per se,
Yes.
if you could actually detect benzene, I mean, it might even be higher because it would depend on what other components of the chemical mixture are that you were smelling.
Have you ever smelled raw natural gas?
Objection.
That is gas that's been produced directly from the well without any mercaptan or other odorizer added to it.
I'm not sure that I have.
Have you, while we're on that subject, Doctor, you have conducted studies in refineries, correct?
I've been involved in them, yes.
And let me talk a little bit about your pliafilm study, if we could, for a second. That was done in 1977 with Mr. Wagner, or Dr. Wagner and Dr. Rinsky and another gentleman, correct?
Yes.
And published in The Lancet in 1977, correct?
Yes.
What is The Lancet, by the way?
It's a medical journal that's published from out of London.
Okay. And in the pliafilm study, you were studying a particular manufacturing process where rubber was dissolved in benzene inside a closed factory. Is that a fair statement?
Well, it wasn't, I was studying the workers that were engaged in the manufacturing of the pliafilm.
Now, in your study, in the introduction, you noted, and I'll just read this, before the 1914-18 war, benzene was used mainly as a solvent in the rubber industry. And I guess by the 1914-18 war, we're talking about World War I, correct?
Yes.
And then you state, but during the war, the demand for toluene in the manufacture of explosives greatly stimulated benzene production. Do you recall writing that?
Yes.
Why did the demand for toluene stimulate benzene production?
I don't know. Maybe benzene was used in the manufacturing of toluene. I would presume that's what it meant.
Well, are you familiar with the benzene ring components? You are, of course, aren't you?
Objection.
What do you mean the benzene ring components?
BTEX, benzene, toluene, xylate, ethylbenzene. You're familiar with those chemicals, correct?
Yes.
And how are those chemicals? Well, let me ask you this. How do we get benzene? Do you go out and drill a benzene well?
Well, I mean, today it's usually from, fractionating petroleum or crude.
So it's crude oil that goes into a refinery and is either distilled or, as you pointed out, fractionated to separate out the various types of chemicals within the crude oil, correct?
Yes.
And benzene is one of those particular crude oils, correct? I mean, one of those particular items that separates out, correct?
Yes, right.
And it separates out separate from toluene, correct?
Yes.
It separates out separate from ethylbenzene, correct?
Well, I'm really not, an expert, and, which is going to separate from what, because I think there's probably contaminant, there's not a clear line of demarcation
In other words,
process.
in all the molecules that comprise the toluene that you talked about for the manufacture of explosives, there might have been some molecules of benzene or xylene in there, correct?
Right, yes.
But more or less, it's separated out from the benzene on purpose. In other words, you don't have half benzene, half toluene. What you hope is to have as pure grade toluene as you can to make explosives, correct?
Objection form.
That's right, but I don't know that, that all of, I can't recall right now. I haven't brushed up on the process of manufacturing the toluene. I don't know what happens after you, do your initial fractionation and end up with these chemicals. They're probably treated with other things then to end up with the toluene and the xylene and the benzene.
Your next statement in your report is currently 87% of benzene is used as a raw material in the synthesis of compounds such as styrene, phenol, and cyclohexane. Approximately 10.2 billion pounds were produced in the United States in 1973. Do you recall that?
Well, I didn't recall that in fact, all the information on the industrial hygiene aspects of that was contributed by the industrial hygienist who's a co-author on the paper.
Okay. You don't have any reason to argue the statement that's contained in your paper that 10.2 billion pounds of benzene were produced in 1973, correct?
I wouldn't argue it. I mean, I don't have, information on nearly how much was there. Mr. Young was the industrial hygienist, and he provided that information, and I assumed it was correct at the time.
And what is your understanding as to where that benzene came from?
Objection form.
Just let me
When it
ask,
came from
that
when?
wasn't a fair
Okay.
that wasn't a fair question. Was there a particular type of facility, such as a fractionization facility or a refinery, that you assumed that benzene came from?
Objection form.
I don't think I even entertained, I certainly didn't entertain at the time where that benzene came from. What year, what year does it say? Are we talking about here? Benzene produced in what year? 1973. Well, I mean, I would think that by that time, most of benzene was produced from petroleum. There's probably still some that was produced from coal tar.
Coal tars.
Yeah.
And the coal tar benzene has been proven to be particularly leukemic in terms of at least AML, or acute myelogenous leukemia, correct?
No.
Okay. Which has been, in your opinion, more likely to have a statistical significance, benzene from coal tar or benzene from refined petroleum?
I guess I'm having trouble with your question, which would be more apt to have a statistical significance. Maybe I could say in terms of toxicity.
Okay.
That's what we're talking about. There's not a difference.
Not a difference, okay. Doctor, have you ever done a study of the levels of benzene present in, strike that, have you ever done an epidemiological study of the levels of benzene present in raw crude oil?
No, I think that would be, I think engineers and industrial hygienists would do that, but I think I haven't done a study of that. I mean, I think that the benzene content of crude is somewhere around 0.1 to 0.2%.
Have you ever
data that I've seen?
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Have you ever done an epidemiological study of the incidences of any of the leukemias in workers who are engaged in the production from the ground of crude oil or natural gas?
An epidemiological study of individuals that are, involved in
In the drilling process?
the drilling process? No.
Do you know of any such study that's ever been conducted?
Well, there may have been some conducted. As we sit here now, I can't cite one to you.
As you sit here, you don't know, correct? Of one?
What I'm saying is probably somebody, I would hope, has evaluated them, but I can't cite one for you right now.
The studies that have primarily been done have been done with refinery workers, correct?
They're the ones I'm aware of, yes.
And there have been a number of meta-analysis with the refinery workers, correct?
No, there have been a few meta-analyses, yes.
Have there been studies done of people who pump or dispense gasoline in gasoline stations?
Yes.
And that was a study, was that study done in the United States or elsewhere?
Well, I'm aware of studies that, in the United States and elsewhere.
Okay. And have the great bulk of the studies that have been done as to people who dispense gasoline into automobiles shown that there is no statistically significant causal effect of pumping gasoline and contracting or developing leukemia, or one of the leukemias, later in life?
No, there's some studies show an effect and some don't.
In fact, the studies that were conducted in the United States show that there was no effect, correct?
The study of gasoline service station attendants and mechanics that was done in the United States shows a significant excess of mortality from leukemia.
Which study is that?
Schwartz.
And the Schwartz study did not do a cell type analysis on leukemia, correct?
They presented information by cell type. They didn't do a statistical analysis separately for cell types. There weren't that many in it to begin with.
Now, Doctor, it's your opinion, is it not, that benzene causes all forms of leukemia?
All the major forms, yes.
And when we talk about cell types, we are talking generally about the types of leukemia, correct?
When we're talking about cell types of leukemia, we're talking about cell types of leukemia. You could talk about cell types of liver cancer or other things.
Certainly, but as far as leukemia is concerned, when we talk about cell types, you have acute myelogenous leukemia, correct?
Yes.
You have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, correct?
Yes.
You have multiple myeloma, correct? That's another cell type.
Well, these are lymphomas now you're talking about.
Yes,
They're
you're
not leukemias.
right. Not leukemias, you're correct.
They're hematopoietic cancers,
Right.
I guess you could use.
And you feel that benzene affects all the hematopoietic systems of the body in some way, correct?
Yes.
And you also feel that,
Well, except for Hodgkin's disease.
okay, you also feel that there are studies, strike that, you also feel that, or it's your opinion, that it causes chronic myelogenous leukemia, correct?
Yes.
And that's another cell type of leukemia, correct?
Well, it's a myelogenous leukemia in a chronic form. It's the same, they're the same types of cells you see in acute myelogenous leukemia, but the clinical manifestation isn't as acute, so it's chronic myelogenous leukemia.
Let me go back to your documents for a second. Well, strike that. Now, you have also worked not for, but in conjunction with the Environmental Protection Agency, correct?
Oh, yeah, I've had certainly, I mean, I've attended a lot of meetings with people and EPA staff.
And while OSHA is designed to protect workers, hence occupational safety, EPA is supposed to protect all of us, correct?
Their responsibility is general environmental exposures.
Are you familiar with the EPA total exposure assessment methodology study concerning the levels of benzene found in the environment?
A while ago, I looked at some analysis that was done by Lance Wallace at EPA. He was trying to determine various places in the environment where people would be exposed to benzene.
And the total exposure assessment methodology study that was done was a non-occupational study, correct?
I believe it was looking for general environmental exposures, not occupational study.
In other words, we're talking
As I
about,
can recall.
talking about homes and communities, correct?
Yes.
That study concluded that there was no causal relationship between environmental exposure to benzene and any of the leukemias, correct?
Objection 4.
I don't believe it addressed disease. I think it was a study of environmental benzene exposures.
Doctor, in your report, I believe, and in your papers, you have discussed the concept of threshold, correct?
I don't, well, I may have mentioned that there's not a threshold for benzene or any, or also a threshold's never been identified for any substance known to cause cancer in humans.
And when we talk about threshold, what do we mean? Just generally.
It would be a level below which you would not have any of the diseases that you were talking about that's related to that particular chemical.
And it's your opinion, as I think you just stated, that there is no minimum threshold level at which exposure to benzene is safe, correct?
One's never been demonstrated.
Has there ever been an epidemiological study that showed that exposure to benzene at a level of, say, 7 parts per billion had a direct causal link to any leukemia?
Objection 4.
I've never seen a study in that dose range or that exposure level range.
Now, when we're talking about a chemical such as benzene, the word background is used, correct?
Well, you could use that.
And what is background?
Well, that would generally, I would think of background levels as what the levels of benzene that you would be exposed to in the general atmospheric air. You know.
So benzene does naturally occur in the air, correct?
Objection 4.
Well, you'll have some, well, it depends on, you know, what types of pollution you have in the area, how much you could detect. You'll detect some.
And
Benzene level, if you have a sense enough system for detecting it.
do you have an understanding of the term ambient air?
Yes,
What does ambient air mean?
it'd be general environmental air.
And so that's basically the outside air that folks breathe as they walk around, correct?
Yes.
And are you familiar with the IARC study done in 1982 as to the ambient air levels of benzene in certain cities?
IARC did a study in 92 of
82.
82?
If I said 92, I was wrong, and I apologize.
Oh, I would find it surprising that they did a study of benzene and ambient air in 82. I know they did a monograph on cancer risk of benzene to humans that was published in 1982.
Okay.
And in that monograph, they may have cited some work that other individuals have done related to benzene and ambient air.
Okay.
But I'm not aware that they've ever done any original work themselves.
Okay. They did do a study wherein IARC published the benzene levels in the ambient air in a number of cities around the world, did they not?
Objection form.
You're saying IARC did?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I don't know that they did this. They probably cited other sources.
And
As best I can recall, I don't believe that they had anyone do any monitoring in other cities.
you looked at Dr. Mattson's report that's contained in this case, correct?
Briefly, yes.
And his opinion was that there were 7 parts per billion in the community where the plaintiffs in this case live, correct?
Objection form. It misstates Dr. Matt's.
I don't, as I recall, I thought his estimate was like something like 240, 260 micrograms per cubic meter.
Well, he did state it as 200.07 parts per million, did he not?
Objection form. Misstates Dr. Mattson's conclusions.
I don't recall if he had it expressed parts per million or not. He may have.
And you're not familiar with the IARC study, so
Well, I'm familiar with the IARC monograph that was published in 1982 related to the, which included an evaluation of benzene.
And
okay,
Go
so I'm
ahead.
familiar with that review.
And
But
are
you were asking me a different question before. I thought you were asking me of a study that IARC did related to benzene exposure in ambient air in various cities throughout the world. And my response was, I'm not aware that IARC did a study, but I think that they cited results from the literature where other people had
Okay.
made some determination.
So in other words, an IARC paper was published in which IARC reproduced levels of ambient air benzene concentrations from various cities around the world. You agree with that, correct?
Yeah, as part of its review on benzene, right? I mean, they also have an error in there for one. There's one estimate they have of benzene exposure from cigarette smoking that has to be a typographical error, or they cited a source that contains a typographical error.
Objection responsiveness.
We talked a while ago about the Wallace study that you mentioned.
Yes.
Now, Wallace and his group found an average of 5 to 7 parts per billion exposure in the environment naturally, correct?
Objection form.
I don't recall exactly what it was. It could have been that, and it was, it would have, I presume, been an average of the areas where they sampled. I mean, they didn't sample the entire United States. I think they took maybe Los Angeles, maybe Bayonne, New Jersey, some heavily industrialized areas. And, they might have included some place in Utah that didn't have it too. I can't recall, but I don't think they have any means for determining, what the average benzene level is in ambient air in the United States, as best I can recall from that study.
Well, as far as the world is concerned, you would agree with me that Zurich, Switzerland is not a heavily industrialized community. Would you?
Objection
I
form.
haven't been to Zurich. I don't know.
Need to go. It's a very nice city.
Okay.
Only defense.
Well, if we don't make it to the Wizards case.
No, the difference is defense lawyers ride coach. Plaintiffs' lawyers take their jet streams. So.
I already know about that.
Dr. Infante, do you have an opinion as to whether or not a 24-hour exposure at 5 to 7 parts per billion of benzene would result in an elevated risk to acute myelogenous leukemia or some other hematopoietic, I can never say that word, hematopoietic disease?
Well, I mean, generally, if you're exposed to more benzene, you have a higher, relative risk of developing the diseases related to benzene than individuals that wouldn't be exposed. I'm not aware of anyone's done a study of the population exposed to 7 parts per billion. I mean, I don't know, if that would be you're saying that's the average level, what would you use for a comparison group?
Well, that's precisely the point. So would you say that that's background?
Objection.
That would be the general population?
Well, I don't know that that's background. You were mentioning that it was an average from some work that
From the Wallace
Lance
study.
Wallace had done.
Okay.
So it might have been an average from the areas that he sampled. So you're asking me, would there be an increase in risk from that? You'd have to, it would be low, but, in order to determine that, you would have to look at the risk assessments that are available, obviously, and extrapolate down.
Sorry. We've talked about benzene levels with the refinery and chemical workers, correct?
Say that again, please.
Right. We've talked about the fact that there have been epidemiological studies conducted with refinery workers and chemical workers as to the effects of benzene on their bodies, their persons, correct?
Yes.
There have also been studies, have there not, of communities that were immediately surrounding refineries, correct?
I can recall some studies like that being done in the past, yes, looking at individuals in petrochemical industry counties. I think there was one by Hoover, and someone published like in the late 70s is one I can recall.
Okay, well, there was one published by Harry in 1980 examining the northern part of Contra Costa County and the southern part of Solano County, California, correct?
Well, I don't know. There could have been. I haven't seen it.
Those studies showed that there was no relationship between cancer incidence and residential exposure to petroleum and chemical emissions, correct?
I said I didn't read the study. I don't know.
So you wouldn't argue with the results, correct?
Objection form. I'm going to.
Well, I wouldn't agree or disagree with them until I reviewed the study.
Okay. Have you reviewed the 1984 Austin study where he showed that emissions of benzene-soluble organics in a community showed that there was no relationship between industrial emissions and cancer?
Objection form.
I haven't reviewed that study.
Doctor, based upon your experience with the Occupational Health and Safety Administration and your professional work as an epidemiologist, would you agree with me that you would expect to find much lower benzene levels in a community adjoining a refinery than you would in the refinery itself?
Well, in general, I certainly would think that would be the case. And you could have some areas of, depending on the wind direction, where you could have some people residing near the refinery that could have higher levels than people that would be working in the refinery say upwind, where there wouldn't be any. But I mean, I haven't done any analysis of that. We're just talking hypotheticals. I'm saying in general that would be the case, but it's possible. You could have more exposure in part of a community than you could in part of a refinery.
You talked about the Hoover study earlier that was done in the 70s.
Yeah.
What type of study was that?
It was what was a study evaluating mortality in counties with petrochemical industry concentrations.
And was the mortality study directed towards any particular disease or any type of particular cell type?
It's been a while since I looked at it. I think it might have dealt with 2 or 3 diseases.
And that included things like kidney cancer?
No, I can't recall now what the specific cancers were. It might have been kidney and leukemia. I don't remember right now.
Did the Hoover study look at leukemia?
I can't recall.
Did it look specifically at benzene, or did it just look at contaminants produced in industrialized areas?
I don't think they had data on benzene. They were looking in areas, I think, that had a certain concentration of petrochemical refining, as best I can recall.
Have you been to McAllen, Texas?
No.
Do you know of any refineries in the area of this community where the plaintiffs live?
No. I have not been there.
And that's fair enough.
Okay.
We talked a little bit about the fact that benzene does appear in the ambient air. There are a number of sources for benzene other than the refining process or the chemical manufacturing process, correct?
Yes.
In fact, benzene, and I know you don't agree with some of the studies, but benzene is present in cigarette smoke, correct?
Yes.
And it's present in a fairly high concentration in cigarette smoke, is it not?
No, it's not.
All right. What is your understanding as to the concentrations of benzene in cigarette smoke?
Well, you would have in the parts per billion range, a few parts per billion.
Could you have as much as 47 to 64 parts per million?
No.
Could you have as much as 47 to 64 parts per billion?
I don't recall that it's that high.
And one of the problems that the epidemiological studies that have been published that look at the effects of benzene from cigarettes is, let me start that question up. One of the problems or health risks that the researchers who have looked at the effect of benzene in cigarette smoke have examined is the fact that it is a direct pathway to the body, i.e. it's sucked, the cigarette smoke is sucked directly into the body. So you don't have an argument over how it's absorbed, correct?
Objection form.
Well, if you're, smoking cigarettes, you'd be exposed to the benzene and the smoke from the inhalation.
Okay.
I don't know that there's more in direct smoke than there is in side stream smoke. I'm not sure.
And by side stream, you mean secondhand smoke?
Yes.
You would agree, however, that the dose is more direct for a smoker, correct?
Objection form.
As compared to whom?
Secondhand smoke.
Well, like I said, I don't recall as we sit here if there's higher benzene content in secondary smoke or in the primary smoke screen. So if somebody were sitting next to someone smoking, they would be directly, inhaling whatever level of benzene was in there, the same as the person smoking a cigarette would be directly inhaling it.
You're familiar with epidemiological studies that have been conducted on smokers versus people who are subjected to secondhand smoke, correct?
Are you talking about mortality? What kind of studies are you referring to?
I'm talking about a cohort mortality study, yes.
I'm not real familiar on the data on secondary cigarette smoke. I think most of the data is related to, I've seen related to lung cancer and asthma in children.
And the cigarette, well, and thank you. And I was, the first epidemiological study that was done concerning the effects of cigarette smoke on human beings in terms of an epidemiological study was the Surgeon General's 1964 epi study, correct?
Well, there was a Surgeon General's report, which probably included epidemiological studies that had been done.
And that showed an epi study that showed that if a person smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day, he was 22 times more likely to contract lung cancer than someone who didn't smoke, correct?
I don't recall what the relationship was, but yeah, I mean, we all know cigarette smoking causes lung cancer.
Dr. Infante, would you expect to find a higher or lower concentration of benzene in an area that had a lot of highway traffic as opposed to an area that's, say, out in the country, rural?
Objection form.
And I'm speaking in general.
In general, if you had an area of higher traffic density, I think you would have relatively higher benzene exposure in the ambient air, in contrast to a rural area where there was no high traffic density.
And that's caused because the motor fuel is not totally combusted and comes out in the form of exhaust, correct?
Yes,
And that's where the benzene is coming from, is from the motor fuel, correct?
I believe so.
Do you, and I assume that the levels that we would be looking at would depend upon the level of traffic, correct?
Objection form.
Well, it's one factor.
What about a railroad locomotive? Would that, you expect it to produce a higher benzene level from its exhaust?
Objection form.
I don't believe so, but I haven't really looked at data on exhaust from locomotives.
Doctor, can you point to a single study that shows that the breathing of automobile exhaust in a setting where there's heavy traffic in any way produces any of the leukemic diseases that we've talked about today?
Objection form.
No, I haven't reviewed any studies.
Do you know of any?
Well, there probably are some that may have been done, but as we sit here, I can't recall any.
Okay.
Objection response on this.
In fact, Dr. Infante, even as to gasoline refinery workers, the studies have shown that there is no causal connection between refinery workers who receive less than 330 ppm over time and the incidence of the leukemiogens that you've been talking about, correct?
Objection form.
Now, could you please ask me that question again?
That probably wasn't a very clear. In terms of examining the refinery workers and the studies that have been done by Wong and Rebay and by others, would you agree with me that those studies show that in order for even a refinery worker to show any incidence or higher than expected ratio of leukemiogens, such as acute myelogenous leukemia, that you would have to have a level of at least 300 parts per million years for that worker to statistically be validly diagnosed as AML as a result of benzene exposure?
Objection form.
Well, I think in your question, you're confusing different studies. Wong has drawn that conclusion from an analysis that he did of the pliafilm cohort, a dose response analysis, not based on his refinery worker studies.
Why would there be a difference between the benzene exposure at pliafilm and one at a refinery?
Objection.
Why would there be a difference?
Why would there be a difference in the number of ppm years required to show causality or causation in the pliafilm as opposed to the refinery setting?
Objection.
I'm not understanding your question.
Well, let me start over. And let's talk a little bit more about the pliafilm study since it's the one that you've worked on.
Well, would this be a good time to take a short break?
It'd be a wonderful time to take a short break.
Off the record at 11:25:41. 11:45:48.
Dr. Infante, when we broke, I had asked you an incomprehensible question, and I want to try to back up and look at your pliafilm study a little bit, and maybe I can get some concepts a little clearer. I'm going to hand you what's been marked as exhibit number 4 to your deposition and ask if this is a true and correct copy of your study published in the Lancet in July of 1977.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Now, this was a true epidemiological study, correct?
Yes.
And we talked a little bit earlier about the types of studies. There are actually various ways that people look at causation. There are epidemiological studies that we've talked about, and there are also a thing called case reports, correct?
Yes.
And what is a case report?
Well, a case report, just like the name sounds, would be a report of a case, usually of disease related to a particular exposure.
And is there a difference in your mind between a case report and a case study?
Well, maybe I can try to amplify my answer on that. I mean, a case report, a case study could be the same thing. There could be a case series, which would be a series of case reports. I would make that distinction, like the things that Dr. Viliani and Aksoy published in Italy and Turkey, respectively, where they published a number of cases of case reports of individuals that had been diagnosed with leukemia that had been exposed to benzene, and then looked at their progression from various types of blood abnormalities to leukemia, and then some also were initially diagnosed with leukemia. That would be what I would call a case series.
Okay. Now, as to the article that you wrote concerning the 3 African American transport workers here in Washington, would that be a case report?
Well, there were some cases reported in there in addition to those 3. It's kind of like in between. I mean, I did an epidemiological analysis, and then I also there are some cases reported in there. So, I mean, it's not per se a cohort study. What I did was aware of these cases and just made an estimate of how many you would have expected based on the number of blacks that were employed at that garage over a period of time, and based on.
And you said blacks. Is there an adjustment that has to be made in certain epidemiological studies due to race?
Objection.
Well, usually when studies are done, you adjust for race and sex and age.
And there are certain races that are not susceptible to certain diseases, correct?
Objection form.
Well, that's not as susceptible.
Okay.
I guess one could say. or at least rates are, for certain diseases, are much lower in certain countries, or certain countries or certain races than others.
Let's talk a little bit about your ply film study, which you have in front of you. This was a study that you did on 2 plants in Ohio. One was the St. Mary's plant, and the other was the Akron plant that manufactured a food wrap that went by the trade name ply film, correct?
Yes.
What company owned the ply film plants?
You know, I think it was, could have been Goodrich.
Goodrich, right.
Can't recall.
And what they did is the first step was to chop up rubber, natural rubber, in an internal mixer, correct?
Yes.
And then there was benzene, pure benzene poured in and added to the mix, correct?
Yeah, the rubber was dissolved in the benzene.
And at some point after this had been done, they pumped that solution out, added hydrochloric acid, and formed rubber hydrochloride, correct?
Yeah, it's been a while since I looked at the process, but generally I believe that's it.
And it's pretty well described over here in the industrial hygiene assessment, which you've already told me you did not write, but you did not write that portion of the report. But after the rubber hydrochloride was transferred, there was more benzene added, correct?
Well, do you want me to read the report?
I tell you what, why don't you take a real quick look at just that section labeled industrial hygiene assessment.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. And basically what happened was that benzene was added at a number of points in the process of making ply film, and then that was sprayed by the workers to make these rolls of ply film, correct?
Yes.
And then that was transferred to another room where it was packed for food wrapping in various sizes. Is that a fair statement?
Well, the food wrap after it came out.
Okay.
Then it was, yes.
Now, when you conducted this study, this is a mortality study? I'm sorry, a mortality study, correct?
Yes.
Could you tell us the difference between a morbidity study and the mortality studies?
Yes, a morbidity study would be looking at disease in a population, whereby you might go in and survey, say, the current workforce, people who are still there, and see how many cases of, or how many people there are with various diseases, where you wouldn't rely on mortality. So and you would then have to compare what would be called the incidence of the diseases you were evaluating in relation to some standard population of incidences of cases of disease.
Are most cohort studies mortality studies?
Yes.
Now, you in your report talk about the National Cancer Institute Chinese study that some people call shorthand the Chinese study. Is that a mortality or morbidity study rather?
Well, there are different aspects of it. I think initially there was mortality studies, and then the most recent update they've included individuals. So it's a morbidity. the most recent update.
And the primary criticism from epidemiologists such as Long and Rebay is that particular study contains too many industries and has a number of other defects such as misdiagnosis, no report of reason of death, etc., correct?
Objection form.
Well, I don't recall that they said anything about misdiagnosis. They, I think, put an estimate on the number of diagnoses that were confirmed, I believe.
Yeah, in fact, the
Review
National
of records.
I'm sorry. In fact, the National Cancer Institute was only able to confirm about 62% of the diagnoses, correct?
No, that's not correct.
It's not correct?
No.
If that were correct, would that be what you would call a confounding factor in this study?
Objection form.
No.
Okay. Why not?
Well, because if they confirmed, let's say, 62% of the cases of disease in the study, that would be 62% more than just about any other mortality study that's ever been conducted.
Okay. Going back to your ply film study, which is exhibit number 4, this particular study has been updated, as we talked about, several times, correct?
Yes.
And this cohort is still being followed, correct?
Well, that I don't know.
Okay. The situation at the ply film plant that we were talking about was that the mixer that was used, which was called a Banbury mixer, you recall that?
Yes.
That was the mixer where the rubber was chopped up and the benzene poured in to melt the rubber, correct?
Well, it's chopped up there. I don't think that the benzene, I'm not sure I don't remember if it's poured into the Banbury or if after it's chopped up it goes to another vessel.
You recall whether or not the Banbury mixer was open or closed?
I don't remember. I would think it would be closed.
Now, whether or not that was the case, this work was all done within an enclosed facility, correct?
It was done, yes, right.
And you would agree with me that where you're looking at a refinery or a chemical plant, you're looking at an outdoor facility that's open and out in the open air, correct?
Objection form.
Let me re-ask that question. Would you agree with me, Dr. Infante, that in a refinery, the vessels, piping, etc., are generally all out in the open atmosphere as opposed to within a closed structure like you had at the ply film factories in St. Mary's and Akron?
Yeah, the vessels and the piping, a lot of it's outdoors. I mean, there's probably some stuff that goes on inside.
And you would expect that some of the benzene vapors that in a refinery would be blown away, and that's taken into account, correct?
Objection form.
I don't know what you mean, taken into account in what?
Taken into account in terms of calculating the ppm years, the dose-response relationship, those types of factors.
Objection form.
Well, I guess you could take it into account. Whether or not it's been taken into account in any of the analyses of exposure, I'm not sure.
Now, one of the criticisms of the ply film study has been that of the 5 people who died at the plant of benzene-associated leukemia, one of them had only worked there 4 days, correct?
Well, there are more than 5, first of all, so I don't know which 5 you're talking about, because there were more than 5 deaths from leukemia identified in my initial study.
All right, how many did you identify?
Let me look. I think there were 7.
Were there 7?
Yes.
Okay.
In an 8th case.
And there's
Initially.
recently been an additional death in that cohort, correct?
Well, there have been a lot more deaths in the cohort.
Well, I'm sorry. There's recently been a death due to leukemia in that cohort, correct?
Well, I mean, there are, a number of additional deaths of leukemia. There's not just a single one.
Okay.
But if you're asking me about, you mentioned earlier a study in 2002. I haven't seen it yet, so
Okay.
if you're referring to something there and that I don't know about, I don't know how many more deaths they might have found from leukemia.
Anyway, within the workers in the 2002 study, you had workers that had at least one worker who had worked as little as 4 days, correct?
Objection form.
Oh, that's possible, yes.
You had another worker that had worked only 9 months, correct?
Well, I'd have to go back and, look at the specifics. That's possible. I mean, the cohort was defined as anybody who was there for a day or more, so.
And we talked just a second ago about dose-response relationships. Could you tell us what that term means?
Yes, generally it means that if you're exposed to more of the product, then you have an increase in the relative risk over those that are exposed to a lesser amount of the product.
And when you're looking at dose-response relationships, you ultimately measure those in ppm person years, correct?
Objection form.
If you're using a cumulative dose model, you would do that, yes.
And if you're utilizing a cumulative dose model, the use of the dose response is an essential criteria under accepted epidemiological practice, correct?
Objection form.
Could you ask me that question again?
Let me just ask it this way. Would you agree that in putting together a proper epidemiological study, that the dose-response relationship is a critical criteria in terms of assuring the accuracy of that particular study?
Objection form.
No, not necessarily. I mean, it depends on what your goal is in the study.
Well, if your goal is to be as accurate as possible in terms of the relative risks or the standard rate of mortality, you would want to know about the dose response, if at all possible, would you not?
Objection form.
If you were asking a question, what's the dose response, then you would want to do a dose response analysis. It depends on what question the investigator is asking. If you're asking the question about, well, is there any elevated risk from workers exposed to benzene, then you wouldn't necessarily include a dose response. It depends on what the question is that the investigators are trying to answer.
In the studies and reports that you have cited in your report in this case, are any of those particular studies or reports that take dose response into consideration in reaching the conclusions that you say they do?
Yes.
Which ones?
The Wong study, the Hayes study, those are two that come to mind.
And the Wong study concluded that there was no statistical significance for the leukemic causation below 300 ppm years, correct?
No, that's not the one I'm talking about.
Which Wong study are you talking
I'm talking about the one that he did for the Chemical Manufacturers Association, where he concluded there was a significant dose response for exposure to benzene and leukemia.
Well, he determined in that there was a specific dose response for one cell type of leukemia, correct?
No, he said there was a dose response for the study that I'm referring to. He concluded there was a dose response for benzene and leukemia, and also for benzene and non-Hodgkin's lymphohematopoietic cancer. It was published in 1987, two papers back to back.
Those are the 1987 A and B papers?
That's correct, yes.
And it's your contention that Wong reached the conclusion that other than acute myelogenous leukemia, that high doses of benzene caused other leukemic diseases or hemopoietic disorders?
I didn't say anything about I didn't mention any levels of benzene. I'm saying, it's not my contention, I'm telling you what he concluded. If you look at the abstract of those papers, he concludes there's a significant dose response for benzene and leukemia. I didn't mention levels. If you want to discuss levels in that study, the lowest level was 15 parts per million years, and his highest cumulative dose group was 60 plus parts per million years. If you convert it to ppm years, he has it in there as ppm months.
Well, if you convert it to ppm years, he found no statistical significance as to the lower dosages, correct?
Well, in a dose response analysis, as you'd mentioned earlier, you look at, is there an increase with an increase in exposure? That's what you're testing for. You're not testing for individual responses at every level of exposure. In other words, is there an increase with an increase in the exposure? That's called dose response. He concluded there was a statistically significant dose response in that study.
And statistically, it shows that the higher and longer the dosage, the more likely a group is to develop, say, acute myelogenous leukemia.
He didn't look at longer and higher. He looked at cumulative dose, which is a product of level of exposure times time. So people could be in the same exposure group if they were exposed to 1 part per million for 10 years or 10 parts per million for 1 year. So you see there you have 10 times different length of exposure. And he didn't conclude about AML because he found a dose response in the absence of identifying any deaths from AML in his study.
Let's go back to the documents we were going through. Thank you. We could set that aside. We're now again looking at exhibit number 2. If you could turn with me to the page that's marked PI 11.
Exhibit 2?
Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Exhibit 3, Doctor.
No.
It's your collection of papers.
Okay. PI 11?
Yes.
Okay.
On PI 11, I can't read on this copy the items that are shown at the end of each one of these little separate, are these areas that you have highlighted?
Yes.
And do you have, well, we can go back and just compare that ETI number to determine what those say. But it seems to say, looking at the 1, 2, 3, 4th from the bottom report, that at the end it says strong, and I can't read it, odor. Can you read that?
We're in the 4th box from the bottom?
No, from the top. Did I say bottom?
Yes. When it begins, silty clay? That
Yes.
one?
It says moderate to strong odor.
To strong gasoline odor.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay.
What were you using that type of observation for?
Well, if there's a strong gasoline odor, that the odor threshold for gasoline is around 35 parts per million. So if there's a strong gasoline odor, that probably the level was, trying to estimate without any sampling data, that it would have been above 35 parts per million.
Yeah. And if we're talking about gasoline again, what percentage of benzene do you expect to find in modern day gasoline?
Somewhere between 1% and 2%, probably I would say 1% now. It's in the United States, it's generally been between 1% and 2%, but it's been, going up. It's probably up to the early 1990s. I think it was probably 1.6, 1.7, depending on if it was high octane or not, around that area. It's been below 2.
And that benzene is in the gasoline as a result of the refining process, correct?
Objection, Frank.
Well, it's in the gasoline as it's made.
In other words,
Gasoline is refined.
Is a refined product.
Yes.
In the European study we talked about earlier of the Nordic countries, where they looked at the gasoline dispenser personnel, you recall that study?
I don't recall we talked about one.
Well, maybe we didn't. There was such a study done concerning thousands of gasoline dispenser, in effect, service station workers throughout Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark. I forget whether or not there were any other, but the Nordic countries in Europe, correct?
Okay. There has been a study done, yes, at least one.
And that particular study was an attempt to show whether or not there was a causal link between the benzene contained in the gasoline and certain blood disorders or leukemias, correct?
They were evaluating is it mortality? I think it was, they were evaluating disease outcome in gasoline service station attendants, I believe, or people that were pumping gasoline.
Now, it's correct, is it not, that the European gasoline during that time period had a much higher concentration of benzene than you would expect to see in U.S. gasolines?
Objection, Frank.
No, I'd have to look back and see what they said the content was. It could have been, maybe 5% or up to 5%.
So it could have been as much as 3 times, 4 times as much as you would expect to see in U.S. gasoline, right? Correct?
Objection, Frank.
Well, we have an average of 1.5, and if they had 5%, it would be, 2 to 3 times, I guess.
Okay. And again, more benzene equals more exposure, correct?
Objection, Frank.
Not necessarily. It depends on what they have in terms of vapor recovery at the pump.
Did that study establish any statistically significant causal link between gasoline at 4 to 5% benzene and, say, multiple myeloma?
No, I'm not aware of a study that looked at multiple myeloma.
Okay.
I'm aware of there are 2 studies that evaluated leukemia. One was published by Lang and one was published by Jacobson. They looked at individuals that were pumping gasoline. One study shows a significant excess and one doesn't.
We're going to have to change tape.
Okay.
This concludes tape 1. in the deposition of Dr. Peter F. Infante off the record at 12/14/28.